All right, so we like to take these deep dives, and today we're really zeroing in on Alibaba, ticker symbol BANYAYA, and you probably heard this name, maybe you've even followed the stock or whatever. But today, March 20th, 2025, share price sitting around $136.99. And look, we're not here to tell you what to do with your money, but we are going to try to break down what we think are some of the most important things that are going on with this company and how it might affect the future of its share price.
Yeah, people are talking about it. There's been a lot in the news, and we've done a lot of reading just to kind of get up to speed. And for you listening, we've read articles from the Financial Times, Barron's, Wall Street Journal, AP News. We've looked at a bunch of the financial analysis sites like TreeFest and Capital Trades, Investorpedia. Yahoo Finance, Investors, Business Daily even looked at some policy analysis from the American Prospect. And just for some good background info, we read the Wikipedia article on the company. So, we feel like we have a pretty well-rounded view of what's going on.
Yeah, and I think the idea here is we really want to pull out what are the biggest positives, what are the biggest negatives that we see kind of on the horizon, and to try to give you a sense of kind of the really big picture things that are going on with Alibaba.
Exactly.
Without, trying to overwhelm you with just too much information.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that keeps popping up, and we saw this in a couple different places. Treffy's kind of talks about this idea, and we also saw this mentioned in some of the reporting in Barron's, this idea that Alibaba could potentially be, kind of a company that actually benefits if the economy starts to really, really, kind of slow down or even, if we enter a recession.
Interesting.
And the thinking there is that, as people have less money to spend, they're going to be looking for more and more, inexpensive ways to buy things. And Alibaba is just this massive, massive marketplace with just, products from, so many different, price points.
Oh, so they're kind of well positioned to be that value play.
Exactly. And I think the question becomes, how does that play out? Like how do their specific strength, like their logistics network, their relationships with all of these different suppliers, how does that actually translate into them being able to really capture that, that market of people who are looking to really, save money?
Right. And on the other side, their recent performance, this is, in the most recent quarter, which ended in December of 2024, they reported an 8% jump in revenue, which brought them to 280.2 billion yuan, or if you translate that to dollars, about 38.38 billion.
Yeah, that's still a pretty healthy, growth rate, especially in, the kind of economic environment that we've been in.
Sure.
And it makes you think okay, so if they're able to grow, that strongly, even in a sort of a more challenging economic environment, what does that say about how they're, adapting and finding new ways to bring in revenue?
Yeah, and one of the really bright spots in all this is their international growth. That division saw a 32% increase in revenue year over year.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's not just, like a little bump. That's a pretty significant indication that their strategy outside of China is really working.
Yeah, that's huge. Because that shows that they're not totally dependent on what's going on, within the Chinese economy, which we all know is kind of its own beast with all the regulations and everything else going on.
Exactly. So that global expansion, could really be, sort of a stabilizing force and a key engine for, future growth.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about the future a little bit, because I think that's where things get really interesting with Alibaba. They're making some enormous investments in the technologies of the future. AI, cloud infrastructure. We're talking about 380 billion yuan over just the next 3 years.
Yeah. And, I think I read somewhere that that's more than they spent on those things combined in the last decade. It's just a massive commitment, to the future. And so you have to ask yourself, what's that going to look like? How's that going to reshape their business, over the years to come?
And it's not just the money.
Yeah.
They're actually making real progress on the AI front. They've got this new large language model, Quinn 2.5.
Right.
And they're claiming that it actually beats DeepSeek's V3.
Okay.
In certain benchmarks, when it comes to things like generating computer code and doing, multiple language tasks and stuff like that, complex reasoning.
Yeah. So if their claims are accurate, in those areas that you mentioned, that could be a pretty big deal because, the AI space is changing so fast.
Sure.
That to be, kind of, at the top of the game, like that could be a real, advantage for them.
Yeah, it sounds like they're really pushing things. They're upgrading their AI assistant, which is called Quark. And this thing, they're adding more advanced reasoning capabilities,
Hmm.
and they want it to be able to do things like help people with academic research,
Yeah.
help people create documents, even more complex stuff like travel planning.
So it sounds like they're really trying to make, these advanced AI capabilities,
Yeah.
something that's really practical for people,
Yeah,
something that they can use every day.
exactly.
Yeah.
And here's one that I think is really interesting. They've got this strategic partnership that's in the works with Apple, and the idea is to integrate uh, AI features into iPhones, specifically
Yeah.
within China.
Okay.
Now, obviously this still has to get regulatory approval and everything else, but if this happens, this could be a huge win for Alibaba.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it, putting their AI, right in the hands of such a massive user base.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Apple is, it's the premium, smartphone in China. So if they're able to get their AI into those devices, not only could that, improve the experience for iPhone users in China, but it's really valuable exposure for them,
Right.
and it could really drive, a lot of people to start using their technology.
Yeah. And then the last thing I think we should mention on the positive side is this massive restructuring that they announced back in March of 2023.
Okay.
And basically they took this huge company
Yeah.
and they split it up into six independently managed business groups.
Oh, wow.
So you've got the Cloud Intelligence Group, Taobao and Tmall Group. Those are the core e-commerce operations.
Mm.
You've got Cainiao, which is their logistics network, and a couple others. And each of these groups now has its own CEO, its own board of directors. They can even pursue their own fundraising and public listings and stuff like that.
So they're really trying to create, almost like a bunch of smaller, more focused businesses. Yeah.
And I think the idea, I mean, if you think about it, like, the Cloud Intelligence Group, that's all about, cloud computing and AI.
Right.
Taobao and Taobao, that's the core, marketplaces that everybody knows.
Right.
Kamaniao, that's about logistics and efficient delivery.
Right.
And the idea is that by splitting these things up, they can really kind of let them each focus, on their specific market,
Hmm.
and hopefully become more agile, more, kind of responsive and ultimately, just more valuable.
Yeah, that's a pretty fundamental shift, in how they're structured, and it makes sense that, if you give these businesses more autonomy, they can move faster,
Yep.
they can, respond to the market more quickly, and ideally that makes them more valuable.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of the potential upsides,
Mhm.
the reasons to be optimistic about Alibaba. But I think it's important to remember that no investment is without risk. And and this is a complicated company. There are definitely some potential headwinds out there, some things to think about,
Yeah.
you know. And actually I think it's interesting because, one of the things that we saw in Trifis was actually kind of a counter argument to that first point about Alibaba potentially benefiting from an economic downturn.
Okay.
you
Yeah.
know, because they pointed out that, yeah, okay, so maybe people will start, buying cheaper things. But what if the economy gets so bad that people just overall spend less money?
Yeah. Right.
And if that happens, even if Alibaba's prices are lower, if the total amount of money that people are spending is way down,
Mhm.
that's going to hurt their bottom line.
Yeah, that's a really important point, because you could see a shift in, the kind of spending, towards, more budget-friendly items, but the total amount of spending, could still be way down, and that's going to affect everybody.
Right. And then, of course, we can't forget about the competition. I mean, especially in China, the e-commerce space is incredibly competitive.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
You've got companies like PDD Holdings.
Yeah.
They've got this platform called Temu that's really growing quickly.
Right.
They just reported a 24% year-over-year revenue increase. A lot of that driven by their online marketing,
Yeah.
and transaction services.
Yeah, their stock's been down a little bit, recently, but that revenue growth, I mean, it's a clear sign that they're a serious player, and they're coming for Alibaba.
And I think that's just a reminder that the Chinese e-commerce market, it's very dynamic.
Mm.
It changes quickly.
It's not easy.
These companies they're really good at adapting. They're very innovative. They're constantly fighting for market share.
Absolutely.
And so, for Alibaba, that means that they have to not only keep their existing customers happy,
Hmm.
but they also have to constantly be finding new customers,
Yeah.
to stay ahead of the game.
Definitely.
Okay, here's something that I think is interesting, and I don't know how much weight to give it, but I think it's something to at least be aware of. We saw some reports about the trading activity of a few U.S. politicians involving Alibaba stock.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So, for example, uh, Representatives Gottheimer and Bresnahan reportedly bought shares earlier this year, and then, on the other hand, Senator Tuberville, uh, he closed out his investment in Alibaba a couple of years ago.
Okay.
So, I mean, this is interesting because it kind of shows you that even among policymakers, there's different opinions about investing in Chinese companies.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating perspective because, these aren't, massive, investments or anything, but it does kind of give you a sense of, the range of views out there. And the fact that there's a lot of, complexity, involved in investing in companies that have, a lot of operations in China,
Right.
especially in the current, global political climate.
Yeah, exactly. And that actually brings us to our last point, which is, we can't talk about Alibaba without talking about the bigger geopolitical picture.
Hmm.
And we're not going to get into the specifics of politics here, but I think it's important to remember that, those big international relationships, any potential changes in, trade regulations and stuff like that, that can have a huge impact on, a multinational corporation like Alibaba.
Yeah, I mean, those are all things that are completely outside of their control, but that could really, introduce a lot of, volatility or uncertainty, into their business. So it's definitely something for investors to keep in mind.
Okay, so as we kind of wrap things up here,
Hmm.
I think it's clear that the picture for Alibaba, it's pretty complicated. I mean, on the one hand, you have these massive investments in cutting edge technologies like the AI. You've got significant growth in their international business. And then you've got this possibility that if the economy does get worse,
Yeah.
they might actually be well positioned because they're kind of a value play.
Right.
But then on the other hand, there's the very real risk that
Yeah.
if we do have a serious economic downturn, people just aren't going to spend as much money overall.
Yeah.
And then there's always that competition.
Yeah.
I mean, these rivals that are coming up, and doing really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, you can't forget about, the global political landscape, I mean, that's always something to think about.
Right. So
Yeah.
it's at the balancing act.
Yeah.
It's a company with a lot of potential, but also a lot of potential risks.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to be excited, especially with all of their, investment in AI and their push to grow globally. But at the same time, there's real challenges out there,
Okay, so here's something for you to think about as you kind of digest all of this.
Mm.
Given how much Alibaba is investing in AI, and how determined they are to expand their business internationally, how do you think those two things are going to affect how they deal with potential economic downturns and that increasingly competitive e-commerce environment?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And maybe another thing to think about is to really look into how those individual business units that they've created through that restructuring, how are they performing? How are they developing their own strategies? Now that they have this new independence,
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting way to kind of look at where Alibaba's headed.
Yeah.
So thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We hope this has been helpful, and we'll see you next time.
See you later.